See you on the other side.
Hello, and welcome to today's session. Today we're talking about connecting app service to data and other Azure services. Once you get your app up and running in Azure, that's when the fun starts. That's when we can really start taking advantage of everything that Azure has to offer. And our instructor, Sydney Andrews, will be taking you through the most important one, how to connect your database. Take it away, Sydney.
All right, Matt, you set me up. I got to be really impressive today. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the last session in our series about deploying JavaScript and open source software applications to app service. We've had a fun series. We talked about just deploying to app service web apps and static web apps. We deployed static HTML pages, Node.js applications, and then Next.js applications run on top of React. I believe we even deployed a Vue application. We went on from there to talk about deployment slots, where we created staging or production deployment slots, and that in and of itself was a lot of fun. We were able to swap the slots and just walk through a realistic scenario of how we could deploy applications between environments. And then taking it from there, we went to talk about Docker and containers, and that was a lot of fun because we built out a lot of containers. We created our own Docker files, so we even did a Docker Compose YAML file to create a multi-container solution for our Next.js application. So that was pretty awesome. And today, we had a lot of really in-depth and fun sessions. I like to just put a bow on everything, take everything we learned over the first 3 sessions, and just kind of pin it down by walking through a scenario where I want to take my excuse me. I want to take my Next.js application, deploy it, connect it to a MySQL database, and then set it up so that I can use some of the services in Azure. One for hosting the MySQL database and another for hosting the credentials and secrets so that my application can access the MySQL database without me hard coding the connection string into the code or even into the application settings. So not as in-depth or extremely complex as some of the demos we've done this week, but my goal today is really just to hit on everything we talked about through the entire set of sessions. So just like every other day, I just want to just jump right on in and get hands-on. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the Azure portal. So that's going to be portal.azure.com. And the same rules always apply to every session. I try to zoom in as much as I can, but if I'm not zoomed in enough, just let me know. I'm more than happy to zoom in further. We have a Q&A, so you can definitely post questions there at any point throughout the series. I'm going to try to answer them as I see them, but sometimes I may be on a point and then I'll come back to them a little bit later. So I try to answer as many Q&A questions as I can. If I don't get to your Q&A question, msusdev@microsoft.com. We try to answer every question we get, and when we can't answer them, we try to get them to somebody who can. So we're always here to help and get you answers to the questions that you have. All right, so we're gonna get started by creating a MySQL database. So I'm gonna go into Azure, I'm gonna create a new resource, and I'm gonna go into categories. I'm gonna select databases. Oh, my mouse jumped on me. And from here, I'm going to select an Azure database for MySQL and just hit create right there. Now there's a couple ways that I could use this service. I'm going to keep things super simple. I'm going to create a single server. So from there, I'm going to use the concierge subscription that I've been using in every other demo, and the MSUS Dev resource group that, again, I've been using every other demo. Now I need to give this server a name. This name is going to be used as part of the host name or the URI that I'll use to access this. So I want to give it something globally unique here. Sydney MySQL server. I don't think anybody else has that. There we go. Now I'm not going to restore from an existing backup. I'm just going to start with no data in it. I'm going to deploy it to ECUS, and I'm going to just choose 8.0 version of MySQL instead of the 5.7, which is the default. Now I could configure how much compute and storage I want to assign. Like, for example, if I'm just building something really simple for a dev test, I can select basic. Today I'm going to just stick with general purpose, which is the most common option, nothing here too fancy. I'm going to make sure the backup is locally redundant instead of geo redundant. That's just in case I want my backups to be replicated across geographies. I can set a retention period for my backups. I can set a default amount of storage, and I can even enable storage auto growth, will automatically increase the amount of storage if I need it. I can also set the amount of virtual cores that are used for this database. And I'm going to leave everything to its default, but I like to call that out when I'm walking through the configuration screen. Now I need to set up my administrator account. So I'm going to set up an admin username of Contoso. You probably recognize this if you've seen our multi-container demo. Now spaces is not going to be a good password. I need a little bit more complex than that. So I'll do spaces exclamation point 23. Now I'm not using this for any real world things, so I'm not too worried about you seeing it. So spaces exclamation point 23, spaces exclamation point 23. Now there's additional settings you can configure, but I'm going to just hit review create from here. It's going to give me estimated cost per month. I did spin up 4 virtual, or well, I did select that 4 virtual cores and a bit amount of storage. Going to hit create. It's creating MySQL server. Now, from here, what I can do is populate this with data once it's ready. Now I'm going to go grab data for somewhere very specific. If you've been following along with some of our other demos, we have a repo, Microsoft Docs, MS Learn, multi-container web app. I'm going to introduce you to Tada, a brand new branch called Docker multi-container. In there, we have a nice little data folder with 4 SQL scripts. So I'm just going to walk you through what they do right now. The first one, create tables.sql. We'll just create 2 tables, a locations table and a location rooms table. That's it. It just creates the tables. The second script inserts all the locations. The third script inserts all the location rooms. And then the fourth script, even though it says 03, adds a primary key to the locations table, or excuse me, changes the ID field into a primary key. It adds a primary key to the location rooms table, and then adds a foreign key between the tables. So for every location, we can have 0 to many location rooms. That's the intended goal here. So let's see, my deployment is still in progress. My server is being spun up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and clone this repo to my local machine. So I'm going to just copy this HTTPS URI. I'm going to open up Windows Terminal. Going to git clone, paste in that URI, and then I'm going to create a folder called Next App, and that's where everything is going to be. So I cloned the repo from GitHub. I'm going to cd into the Next App folder. Clear my screen so it'll be a little bit easier to read things. I'm going to open up Code Insider. So I'm using the latest version of Insider's build of code at the current directory. So hit Enter. And there we go. I'll zoom in just a little bit on Visual Studio Code. There we go. All right, so there's my project. Everything's here. Now, by default, when you clone, it's going to be in the default branch, which I believe for this project is main. Now, if I wanted to, I could just switch it out to Docker multi-container using the command line. So git checkout Docker multi-container. I'll just switch my branch. So we switch back. We'll see that we're in the Docker multi-container branch. All right, let's go back to the browser. Let's see, MySQL ready? Just a little bit more time. That's all right, no worries. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take these SQL scripts that we talked about, and I'm going to open up this MySQL database in the MySQL Workbench. If you haven't installed this before, it's a completely free tool. It allows you to manage and interact with a MySQL database. There's plenty of other alternatives to MySQL Workbench. I just like MySQL Workbench because it's made by the same group. So it's kind of one of those things. I've been using MySQL Workbench for a long time. Somebody said, is there a link out there that compares Visual Studio Code regular build to Insider's build? I don't know if there's a link that does that, but what I can do is code. Let's see. Code.visualstudio.com is the URL for Visual Studio Code. You have your stable build, which is the normal one. If you select Insiders Edition here, it allows you to get the latest release a lot more frequently. If you go to the blog, it'll tell you how they got to the Insiders build. And then you can see the Insiders Release Notes wiki page, where you can see lots of stuff what they plan to iterate on this month. The release notes for this month right now, let's see, trying to see what's the most recent file in here. So I can show you a really good example. Let's try this one, 157. This was released a couple hours ago. A couple changes to terminal tabs, browser debugging with Edge, a couple updates there, and non-code files to now have a go to definition feature. So it's a couple different ways to find out what's going on in Insiders. Fun fact about Visual Studio Code is pretty well used by a lot of people. So even though I'm running Insider build, I don't run into any real bugs. I mean, I'm sure maybe one day I'll run into some really strange bug, but nothing severe has ever really happened to me yet. But you can always install the regular Visual Studio Code if you want. All right, so we have our MySQL server. We have some credentials that we can use. We have our host, which is the name of the resource.mysql.database.azure.com. And your login name is going to be that server admin login at the name of your resource. So for here, it would be Contoso as Sydney MySQL server. So let's try that out. So Sydney MySQL server.mysql.database.azure.com. I'll copy that to my clipboard. I'm going to open up the MySQL workbench and add a new connection. So I'm call this Contoso Spaces. Host name is the one I just copied and pasted from the portal. The port is 3306. My username is going to be Contoso at Sydney MySQL server, just like we saw in the Azure portal. Now, if I try to test it now, I'm not going to be able to connect for a couple reasons. The most important is if I hit test connection, it's going to say, hey, your client is not allowed to connect to this MySQL server. Well, just like with Azure Database for SQL and Azure Database for Postgres, you have to go to connection security and configure access, whether you want to allow or deny people to access this through public internet or just through your virtual network. You can configure that here. You can configure firewall rules. Like, do you want to allow Azure services to access this database? Oh, excuse me, this server? Yes. Do you want to add your current IP address? Sure. Do you just want to add any IP address? Well, this is just a quick demo, so I'm just going to allow all IP addresses. I don't really care. And then one more setting that's, I think, important for this demo. Are you going to enforce an SSL connection? Normally, with a real-world solution and a production application, yes, absolutely, enforce SSL connection. Because this is just a quick demo, we're just playing around, I'm going to hit disable right here and hit save. So now what it's going to do is going to not enforce SSL connection, so we can just connect to it without using SSL. It's going to allow all IP addresses, and it also allow access from other Azure services. Excuse me, such as Azure App Service. So hopefully I got this all set up correctly. So I've hit test connection. It's going to ask me for my password. Let's save my password in the vault so I don't have to keep typing it. That was at spaces !23. Hit OK. There we go. We've successfully connected. So I hit OK. There's my Contoso Spaces connection. I've already loaded up everything. So I'm going to create a schema called Contoso DB. And if you're coming from a SQL world, think of this how you would think of, well, it's not fair to say, think of it like you would think of a database, but it's kind of a parallel if you've never worked with MySQL before. So create a schema called Contoso DB. And there are definitely technical differences. I just don't want to get into a MySQL versus SQL thing here. Somebody said, am I using a dev license for SQL Server? So this is MySQL. The licensing is included in the cost of the service. Very much just like if we're using Azure Database or Azure SQL Database or Azure Database for SQL, the licensing is included in cost of the service. Now, there are definitely some variants where you can bring your own license, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm showing today. And that's definitely a licensing conversation you can have if you want to have it. All right, so I have my create tables SQL script. I'm going to run that to create my two tables. If I refresh, there's my two tables, location and location rooms. There's nothing in here yet. If I try to execute a query, you'll see it's quite empty. Going to insert all the locations I can. Since I picked a pretty beefy option, it's going to be pretty fast. There we go. Insert into the locations. So if I go run my location query, I'm now going to have quite a few results here for my locations. Awesome. Going to insert my location rooms. Let that run. See a little spinning indicator. It indicates still running. I know when we get to like number 300 or 400, it'll be done. And it's fun because if you play around with the different sizes, like for instance, you use that dev basic size, this can actually take a couple minutes. Whereas I'm doing more of a production ready sizing, so it ran pretty fast. So it's really interesting to see that when you're playing around with the different sizing options, how it actually has a real world effect on your throughput and performance of running these queries, so that you can choose the right amount of performance for your solution. So let's see, we have locations. We have location rooms. And you'll see each location room references a location. Now, my Next.js application uses a data.json file for all of its data. And that's great, but I switched to an ORM. I'm going to use, I believe it's Prisma.io. Prisma. Awesome. And that's what we're going to use for our object relational mapper. So if you're coming from .NET World, that'd be kind of like your entity framework. I'm actually not sure what a popular ORM is for Java. Somebody's probably going to say it in the Q&A and make me feel silly, but I just have no idea. Okay, so we have our data, but one of the things Prisma requires is that every table has a primary key. So our locations table already has an ID field that has a string. I can use that as a primary key. My location rooms, since they don't have any primary key at all, I need to create one. So I'm going to do an alter table statement. I'm going to change my locations table and change the ID into a primary key. I'm going to add a new column to the location rooms table called ID, and that'll just automatically increment. And I'll make it the first column because I'm a little bit lazy. After that, I'll add a foreign key. So for every location, you have 0 to many rooms, and every room is associated with a location. So just run all three of these. Okay, so if I go back, run my locations query again, nothing's changed here. It's just the ID field here is a primary key now. But run location rooms, I have a new ID field. It's just a number that increments, just so my ORM is happy. Awesome. So as far as MySQL is concerned, my data is seated. I'm ready to go. So I'll go ahead and minimize this. I'm going to test my code manually. So how do I want to do that today? I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go ahead and close what I've opened, and I'm going to look at my package.json file. That's one thing I've learned to do over the years is when in doubt, look at the package.json file. Sometimes it's even more useful than the wiki or the README. So it looks like there's 3 scripts here. There's the dev script. It runs Prisma generate to generate a Prisma.js file based upon our schema. And if you're not familiar with Prisma, basically you define a model and it gives you really rich models to query on rather than trying to hard code strings and do all that fun stuff. So in order for Prisma to work, you need to generate a JavaScript file based upon these models. Once it generates that JavaScript file, it'll run next in dev mode, which allows us to do instant refreshes if we change the code, all that fun stuff. When we're ready to go to production, we'll rerun that generate again, and then run next build, which will create a production optimized build. And then when we're ready to start the application, we'll run next start, specifying port 80 as our port of choice. That's pretty much the difference between this package.json ones you've seen before, other than adding Prisma as a dependency. So let's try it out. We're gonna open up Windows Terminal. We're gonna run npm install to install all of our npm packages. And then once we run npm install, we're going to npm run dev to run our dev script. So I'll just let that install real quick. Look to see if we have any Q&A questions. Q&A is kind of quiet, so hopefully that means I'm doing a wonderful job of explaining everything and not that I've lost everyone. Because you never know on this side of the fence whether you've done a terrible job of explaining things or a wonderful job. So you never know, but it's always fun. All right, so let's see. npm install, still running over here. Give it a second. Oh, that's always terrifying when it pauses. Let me just make sure it's not actually locked up or anything. All right, I'm going to do the very bad thing, which is Control C and just run npm install again. Everybody ignore that last npm install run. There we go. Well, the good news is some of it should be cached. Somebody says, hey, npm install. What is that equivalent to? If you ever used any other programming language for a package manager, that's the equivalent of restoring packages. So for instance, if you use .NET, it'd be like .NET restore. If you use any other package manager, like for instance, if you use in Python and you're using a bundler to get your packages, or you have packages in your gem file, you want to install those packages, it's pretty much restoring those packages. So I don't think anything wrong with npm. It's just this UUID package where I probably should find a much much simpler package. The UUID, it seems to lock it up each time. There we go. Let me zoom out. Make sure I didn't break anything. Super weird, but luckily we only have to run npm install once. Just take a question. All right, couple questions in the chat. Hey, if I stop the MySQL server, how does that impact billing? So I do something really weird that some people hate, but I never answer billing questions. I actually take you to the documentation page because I want you to read it and get a really good answer for yourself that you feel comfortable with. And then if you got other questions, that's when you hit us at msusdev@microsoft.com. So for the MySQL scenario, we can go down to Azure, go to databases, Azure Database for MySQL, and that's not being negative. I actually purposefully don't really answer off the top of my head pricing or billing questions because I don't want to mislead you, don't want to give you the wrong answer, and I want to empower you to be able to look this up anytime you want. So I'm at the Azure Database for MySQL documentation, and under the resources section, just like for every resource in Azure, there'll be a pricing tab, and it'll walk you through how pricing works. So you have a database server, you have provision compute, and then you're charged per storage. So let's see. And I'm looking because my understanding with Azure Database for MySQL is that as long as you have the compute provision, even if you're not using it, you can be billed. But I want to make sure I don't tell you this wrong. Let's see. Yes, so I believe, and if I'm wrong about this, Matt just send an email at msusdev@microsoft.com. We'll follow up. But I believe as long as you have the compute and a storage provision for Azure Database for MySQL, you'll still incur billing. Much like with virtual machines, where you can pre-provision compute and storage, and as long as that is provisioned to you, you will have some billing for that. Now, if you have no use for it anymore, you can always deprovision it, create a backup, and then create a new instance for that backup if cost management is a really important part of your workload. And I believe flexible server and this is a little bit beyond my limits with MySQL, so we're definitely going to encourage you to send email msusdev@microsoft.com. But I think Flexible Server has some functionality there to help manage those scenarios. A lot of database services in Azure are moving to throughput-based and serverless-based deployment models where you're actually only billed for real usage rather than for pre-provisioning, compute, and throughput and storage. All right, going back, lost my track there. Let's see, all right, npm install has worked. Trying to make sure. So if I run npm run dev, Prisma is generating a model for my schema.prisma file. And for those who are interested, what Prisma is doing behind the scenes is actually in real time generating in build time generating a JavaScript file that maps to those Prisma models we created. And then from that JavaScript file, that's what we'll end up querying in our application code. Yeah, this is super weird today, but I just ran all these demos about a half an hour before we started, and now everything's running a little slow on my machine. I'm not doing anything in the cloud or remote right now. This is just a local dev build, and I don't know if I messed something up. So let me try a different terminal. Clear npm run dev, Prisma generate. So while we're waiting for this to load, and this is super weird. This normally builds for me and starts in less than 10 to 15 seconds. So I'm not sure what I screwed up here. But somebody asked a question, hey, if you got a lot of questions about these type of things, like not just on the Azure side, but from the development side, using these tools, where can we go to get answers? The Microsoft technical communities are a pretty great resource if you have questions, especially on development workflows, stuff like if you want to architect a solution, if you want to set up infrastructure, if you want to set up a development workflow with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. The Microsoft technical communities is a wonderful place to go because there's a whole community of people talking about a lot of these same topics. Okay, something is super weird going on with my machine. So what I'm going to do is the same thing we do whenever we have any type of problem. I'm going to go with the scorched earth policy. I'm going to just create a brand new folder and start over. We've had a great week of demos, and then on the final session, I finally blow up everything. So git clone, and I'll just call this folder NA for next app. CD into the NA folder, code insiders, dot on that NA folder. Going to run npm install. And I apologize about this delay, everyone. Something super weird happened with that last folder, and npm wouldn't install packages, and next wouldn't build. I have no earthly idea what was going on. It looks like a little chat in the Q&A, people talking about the pricing calculator. It's a wonderful thing. I use it all the time. So there we go. npm installed just fine. Should have went with this first. I'm going to do npm run dev to do my Prisma JavaScript file generation. There we go. It's generated. And my dev server is running at localhost 3000. Wonderful. So switching folders solved everything. So localhost 3000. And there's my Next.js app running. Awesome. Everything is running good. And I'm pretty happy. Now, let me start telling you what's going on here behind the scenes. So the way Prisma works is Prisma will go in and connect to a MySQL database. So I'm running the regular Next app. I'm going to go ahead and close my browser window. I'm going to switch to that Docker multi-container branch Actually, hold on. Let me stop the dev server. I'm going to switch to the Docker multi-container branch. I'm going to npm install one more time, just in case there's any new packages I didn't pick up. All right, picked up our packages. npm run dev this time. Now we're going to run a dev server again, but this time I expect it to fail. Now you may go, Sydney, why are you expecting it to fail? That's a very negative and pessimistic outlook. Well, right now we have our application. It's got an ORM. It's expecting a MySQL database, but I haven't actually pointed it to any MySQL database. So let's just go in, localhost 3000, and it's going to say, hey, I need a connection string. So let's see. There we go. Environment variable not found, MySQL connection string. And for those who are interested, that's defined in my schema.prisma file. It says, hey, I need a MySQL connection string in their format. So we need to give it that connection string, and we can do it a couple different ways. I'm going to show you 2 different ways we can do this in dev. So you can edit the environment variables for your own machine and account. You can just do that manually. I've seen people do this before. So MySQL connection string, and all of these in the show notes if you're trying to follow along with the syntax. For Prisma Next.js, the syntax is MySQL : / the username, which I can't remember, so let's go back. That username is Contosa at Sydney MySQL server. And I'll just put it over here. There we go. MySQL connection string, MySQL : / Contosa at Sydney MySQL server, colon, the password, which is spaces, !23, at the host, which is Sydney MySQL server.mysql.database.azure.com, port 3306, and then the schema is Contoso DB. And I don't expect myself or anyone to memorize this, so I'll copy and paste this into Notepad. Hit OK, hit OK. And one cool thing, I can just close this, close terminal. So I get a new set of environment variables loaded into my terminal. CD into an NA folder, npm run dev. It's going to generate my Prisma schema again. Should be faster since it's already been generated once. There we go, Prisma schema loaded from my schema.prisma file. It's going to tell me to generate a JavaScript file in just a second. And my application is ready at localhost 3000. So I'll go refresh. And my local application should be talking to the MySQL database in Azure. There we go. So we're backed by the MySQL database in Azure. There's our data. We can go to our list of locations. Wonderful, our sample applications worked out great. Everything's awesome. Now from here, what I can do is I can just take it a step further. I've already ran the dev build. Let's test out that production build. That's what we're going to want to do on app service. So we're going to go back into Visual Studio Code. And this time, instead of running npm run dev, we're going to run 2 commands. We're going to run npm run build first. That will generate our Prisma schema and then create a production optimized build of our Next.js application. And if you remember our session where we learned how to build everything in Docker container, we've done this before. Once we're done there, we'll go ahead and create that optimized production build. You'll see it'll actually walk through the files. If you have any files that can be generated statically, it will do that. Since we're connected to a MySQL database, we're limited in the amount of files that will be generated statically. So npm run start. We'll start our application at port 80. So if I go to the browser, wrong browser. Let's change that port number for 3080, or you can just put no port number in. That'll do the same thing. And there's our application. So we did both a dev build and a production style build. Everything works. So go ahead and close. So that's our application we're going to be deploying to app service. Now, I could deploy the code manually. I could deploy it from Visual Studio Code. I can deploy it from GitHub using the deployment center. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to build upon what we've been working on all of our previous sessions. I'm going to create a Docker container image, and then I'm going to deploy that to Docker Hub. So let's get started with that. I'm going to open up Windows Terminal one more time. Actually, before I do that, let me show you the Docker file one more time. This is the same exact Docker file we've seen all the previous sessions. For Node Alpine, change our working directory. Somebody actually called out that we don't have to say apps since they're our working directory. I'm going to copy everything into the working directory. We're going to run npm install. We're going to run npm run build, expose port 80, and then our default command for our Docker file is npm run and start. So let's test this out. Docker build. I'm going to create a tag. We'll call this fun next app. We'll build the current directory, or the Docker file in the current directory, excuse me. So it's downloaded our node container image. It's transferring the content from the local machine into that Docker file, copying the correct things over, running npm install. It's going to run after that npm run build, expose the port, and then set our default command. You notice when it runs npm run build, the output is the same as when we ran npm run build, excuse me, on our local machine. That's just on purpose, just to show you, hey, it's going to output all the same stuff. We're just running this build in a different context. That's all we're doing. Nothing too crazy, no demo magic, no magician hat rabbit jumping out the hat here. All right, awesome. Everything's good to go. So, you know what? Let's go into Visual Studio Code. We're going to open that Docker extension. We're going to see that we have fun next app as one of our container images. Going to right click it and hit run. And what Visual Studio Code will do, Docker run, detach, publish port 80 is port 80, the latest version of this container image. Awesome. So we should just be able to go in our browser. It's localhost 80, hit enter, and we should have a working, oh no, we don't have a working application. Because there's one interesting thing about when we run that Docker build. Within Docker, our environment variables are different. So even though I have an environment variable on my local machine that we went over and talked about, that MySQL connection string, that doesn't exist within the context of Docker. And that's actually really good because it keeps us disciplined knowing what's environment variables and what we have to carry between environments. And that MySQL connection string is what we're going to be focused on for the entire remaining aspects of this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it from my local machine. Hit OK. Going to go back to, I don't know, Visual Studio Code. I'm going to stop this container. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Windows Terminal. Just like we learned, Docker run, detach, publish. I'm going to publish port 80 as port, I don't know, 5000. But this time, if I say, I believe it's called Fun Next App. Yes, Fun Next App. If I just say Fun Next App, I'm going to run into the same issue, that it doesn't have the environment variables I need. So I'm going to add another flag. This is going to be called that -env. And this allows me to set environment variables. So I have the MySQL connection string equals, and this is why I copied this connection string. I didn't want to have to remember this every time. I pasted my connection string. And so now we're going to run this Docker container and set an environment variable. Now, I'm purposely showing you this locally because when we do this in Azure, a lot of times you can get tripped up. Well, hold on, I have environment variables that have different settings in Azure than it has on my local machine, and I have to, manipulate them, change them. That's exactly how we want to develop. We want the developer have one connection string value on their local machine. When you're running this in Docker, whether it's a dev build on a build server, whether it's talk about integration tests on your local machine, or it's running in prod. You want to take advantage of those environment variables to inject new settings. And that's what we're doing here. We're running this Docker container, but we're injecting a MySQL connection string when we run it. So I hit enter. There we go. It's running. If I go to Visual Studio Code, I'll see Fun Next App is running at port 5000. I'll click. And here's our application working again. Hooray! We got it working again. All right, everything's looking good. So I think we're dangerous enough to go to Azure. So I'm going to take this Visual Studio Code instance. I'm going to just stop this container from running locally just because I don't need it to. I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code, and there's my Fun Next App container. image, and the latest version or tag is latest. So I right click, select push. It says, okay, where do you want to push? Well, I can push to a registry that I already have, or I can create a new registry. And I apologize, I have an old registry I had connected there. I should have disconnected that. So let's create a new Azure Container Registry. So we're going to go into the Azure portal. I'm going to hit create a resource. I'm going to hit containers. We're going to create an Azure Container Registry. This basically is our own private container registry that we can push our images to. So I'll just create one in MSUS Dev, and I'll call this Sydney Registry. I'll put it ECUS, and I'm going to just leave everything else to the default settings. So nothing too complex here. It shouldn't take long at all. If it takes more than a minute, I'll be completely shocked. But it's going to create a new container registry that we can use right away. Now, what do I mean by right away? I mean this. I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code. I'm going to right click, find next app. I'm going to hit push. It's going to say, do you want to connect to a registry? Yes. Okay, what type of registry? Azure. All right, which description? I use concierge description. Which registry? Sydney Registry. That's the one I just created. All right, you want to call this Sydney Registry.AzureCR or Azure Container Registry.io/fun next app :latest for the tag. I can do that, or I can just say amazing application :v1. Hit enter. So logging in Azure Container Registry and running Docker push Sydney Registry AzureCR.io amazing application v1. So there we go. It's pushing this container from my local machine, which may have one definition on my local machine, to Azure Container Registry where it has a completely different tag name. And this is really useful, especially if you're doing builds and you have a very specific build naming scheme you want to use locally or in dev. But when you're in your container registry, you may have some different business requirements on how you want to name and organize things over there. So just like we did with Docker Hub, we pushed our container registry. And somebody says, what Visual Studio Code extension am I using for Docker? This is going to make you laugh. It's literally called Docker. So Docker extension made by Microsoft. Can't miss it. It's the official one made by Microsoft with more than 9 million downloads. It's amazing. I absolutely love it. I know how to do all this for the command line, but to be honest, to be able to see visually that the commands I'm running are working correctly helps me a lot with working with the command line. All right, so our container image is pushed. If we go back to Azure, we'll have our container registry. We'll go down to repositories, because one of the fun things I like to say, and this drives some people mad because it's a technical difference, but as a developer, I like to think of a container registry as a code repository for container images. You have your image repositories and you have tags, which is essentially like versioning. So we have the v1 tag here, and there we go. There's our container image at Sydney Registry AzureCR.io/amazing application v1. Now this is protected, so you can't really pull this unless you're authenticated. And that's if you're using AAD authentication. But some services, such as Azure App Service, will require some type of user account. The way we do that in Azure Container Registries, we just go to Overview, hit Update, and we just enable an admin user account. Hit Save. We go back to Sydney Registry. I believe it's under Access Keys. Yep, there's our admin username, Sydney Registry, and a password. I'm going to regenerate this and delete all these, so it doesn't matter to me too much that everybody sees the password in the demo. All right, so I have my Sydney Registry with that really cool container image. So let's create a web app. So we're going to go to Microsoft Azure. We're going to create a resource, the thing everybody's been waiting for. We're going to create a web app. We'll hit web app. And I'm going to create it in MSUS Dev resource group. And from here, I'm going to call this Sydney Super Awesome Web App. And we've been working on this for 4 sessions, so I think we have to give it an amazing name. So hit Docker Container. We're going to run it on Linux OS, ECUS region, just because that's the one I've been choosing all day. I'll create a new app service plan. I'm going to call this Awesome Plan. Hit OK. Going to go to Docker settings, and I'm going to do something absolutely crazy. I'm just going to deploy the Nginx landing page, because why not? We're going to deploy that Nginx container image. So it's creating my web app. It's going to take a second because I have to create the app service plan and then the web app. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to see the Nginx placeholder page. We're going to set up some of our settings and then deploy our container image. So let's Give it a second for any Q&A questions that might be filtering in. Looks like a lot of them are addressed. Good questions so far, everybody. Thank you so much. Yeah, it looks like we addressed most of the questions. If you come up with some more questions, definitely shoot them over to Q&A. We're going to keep pausing and go over there and look at questions. So, all right, we have our web app. We've deployed the Nginx container image to it. How do I know? Well, I'll go to Deployment Center. Same deployment center we've been looking at all week. I'll see a single container for mcr.microsoft.com. It's the app service static site, which is based on Nginx. Hit logs. Always joke that logs are like a watch pot bowling. Sometimes I click through too fast and the logs aren't quite ready for me yet. Here, let's hit the browse button. Looks like our placeholder page is there, so the container image hasn't been deployed just yet. I'll hit logs. There we go. So downloaded the Nginx image. It says it's ready to serve requests. I'll hit refresh. We make sure it's pulling the right container image. App service static site. Oh, I keep saying Nginx, but I pulled the app service static site image. I apologize for that. Let's pull Nginx instead. So instead of private registry, we're going to pull from Docker Hub. Instead of the app service static site, we're going to pull Nginx, because why not? But hit save. I don't know why I keep saying Nginx. It clearly says on the screen app service static site. So we're pulling Nginx now. If we go to logs, we'll see app service static site was pulled earlier. If we hit refresh, we'll go down. It's now pulling from Docker Hub library, Nginx. It's almost done pulling. Go down some more. There we go. Nginx is downloaded. Download Nginx latest. It's ready to serve requests. So if I hit refresh, there's the Nginx landing page. You saw another mistake. Today is a super mistake day. Okay, let's do it again. But this time, we're going to do two things. We're going to go to configuration, and we're going to create a new application called MySQL connection string. We're going to paste in that connection string we've been using for our application the whole time. Now, this doesn't impact the Nginx page at all. We'll hit save. Nginx, this doesn't impact it at all, so nothing will happen there. And now we're going to go to Deployment Center. From Container Registry, instead of Docker Hub, we'll say Azure Container Registry. I'll select my Sydney registry, the amazing application image, and the tag is v1. I'll hit save. And if I did everything correctly, I should be able to go to logs, hit refresh. It's starting to download my container image. All right, Sydney registry.azure.cr.io, amazing application v1 is using that admin user account automatically. I'm just hitting refresh so you can see that it's churning. It's chugging on along. It's done extracting. It's a big container image. So the first thing I'm going to be talking to my dev team about is how do we make this container image smaller? I think it's like 300 megs, which is insane to me. But that's what happens when you put together a demo application. You just pull as many frameworks as you can, and you don't really think about the size. So there we go. It's still doing all that extracting. Look, don't see any questions in the Q&A. I'm just refreshing so we can see the logs. There we go. It's a lot of scrolling. There we go. Image pull successful. Are we ready? It doesn't say ready to serve requests yet. There we go. Now it says ready to serve requests. So if I hit refresh, fingers crossed, Contoso Spaces, powered by MySQL. Awesome. So we're almost all the way there, but I want to do one more service because I said services plural, and we only use two, and two doesn't feel like enough to be plural. So let's add a third service. One of the things I don't like is hard coding my connection strings into the application settings. It's fine, but I feel like I don't have any command and control here. So for instance, let's say I have 3 web apps that all use the same connection string to a MySQL server. If I need to change it, I need to change it in 3 different places. If one of those applications connection strings gets exposed, maybe somebody set in wrong RBAC permissions or some other reason it gets exposed, then the others are at risk too. So I like for this application to be able to get to this connection string, but for me as a user, I like to obfuscate this as much as possible. So if I can use some type of hardware security module to keep my secrets and then connect to these services, I can that just be a much better solution. So let's do that. Let's take our MySQL connection string. I'm gonna go ahead and delete that, hit OK, hit save, and we are purposefully crashing our application. So there should be some tears going on right now. Let's just refresh. It takes a second for the application settings to apply. There we go. And crash. Same server error we saw locally. Now from here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new service. And hit create a resource, and I'm going to type in Key Vault for Azure Key Vault. And Azure Key Vault is basically secret, certificate, and key management for your Azure services. You can also use it for on-prem services. So I'm going to create a Key Vault in my same resource group. I'm going to call this Sydney Vault because I like that name. Oh, it's already in use. Sydney Key Vault. There we go. ECS region, and I'm going to just leave everything to standard settings. Hit review and create. I'm going to create this Key Vault. All right, and Key Vault's pretty fast to create. All right, so now that I created my Key Vault, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to just jump in to the Key Vault, and I'm going to create a secret. I'm going to create a new secret called MySQL con str. And for the secret value, I'm going to go ahead and paste in my connection string. Now, I apologize. It looks like my door opened. One of my kids is closing the door right now. Got a broken door, and these things happen when you have a broken door. All right. So what is a secret? A secret is really just a key value pair. Some string for the secret name, and then some value. And then you can set activation date. So when is the secret active? When does the secret expire? Whether it's enabled or not. You give a set of content type for the secret. So you know what? I'll call this MySQL Prisma con str connection string. I hit create, and I've created a secret. And the cool thing is it's versions, so I can create new versions of the secret. Maybe I'm updating the connection string. And for the current version, it has a URI that I can use to identify that secret. Now, I'm going to take that secret URI and I'm going to do something absolutely crazy. I'm going to delete my connection string and paste in the secret URI. I don't need it anymore. The secret's stored in Key Vault. So I have the secret URI, which is just a indicator or really a resource path that points to the name of my secret and the current version. That's all I need for now. I'm going to go back to app service to Sydney's super awesome web app that's still throwing an error. And I'm going to enable an identity. So I can either have one that the system or Azure creates, or I can create an identity. And this identity will actually be an identity with its own ID field on our Azure Active Directory, redundancy intended. Excuse me. I'm going to create a system assigned identity and hit save. And essentially what it's doing is it's creating an account. Not the same as the type of user accounts you use to log in, but just an account. Think of it like an account on a directory with its own unique object ID. And this account will have access to different things in Azure. Nothing by default, but I can use role-based access control to give it permissions to do things like access storage or access queues, or I can manually go into other services and give it permissions. So I'm going to copy this object ID because that's the unique identifier for this managed identity. I'm going to go back to my Key Vault. I'm going to create an access policy. This is how we tell Key Vault who can have access to it. So I'm going to add a brand new access policy. I'm going to say this access policy will give permission to get or read secrets. as long as it has the URI. So I'm going to select the principal. Who should have this permission? Remember, I copied that object ID. I'm going to paste that in right here. I'm going to say, you know what, Sydney's super awesome web app. So it's kind of weird because I'm treating an Azure app or resource like a person. So Sydney's super awesome web app should have permission to get a secret as long as it has the URI. So I hit select. You can select multiple principals. You can select groups. You can select real accounts or just managed identities that point to different Azure services. You have a lot of flexibility here. And we've even had a wonderful session around Azure AD development with lots of videos on YouTube about it and hands-on demos. It was a lot of fun. So we're going to hit add. And there's my Sydney Super Awesome web app. It has permission to get secrets. So I hit save, and we now have access policy. So everything on the Key Vault side is configured. I want to be able to access that secret. So for Sydney Super Awesome web app, I'll go back to my configuration. I'm going to go back to my application setting for MySQL connection string. And this time, instead of pasting in the connection string manually, I'll say Microsoft.keyvault secret URI equals, and now just paste that secret URI in. Let's see, I still have that. So I'll copy that, paste it in here, hit OK. And once I hit save, you'll notice that over here, source will change from app service config to Key Vault reference. If I have a typo, it'll be a red X. If I got it correct, there'll be a green check mark. Even though I can click show me the value here, it still only shows me the URI pointing to the secret. But the actual application itself will have access to the connection string. So if I refresh my application right here, let's give it a second. There we go. We're connected back to the MySQL database. And a couple of questions already came up. Somebody says, okay, I really like this, but what if I wanted to use a certificate instead of a secret? You absolutely can. If you wanted to enforce HTTPS for your application, you can definitely do that. So you'll see certificates used quite often if you have Azure services directly talking to each other. So a really good example of that is if you're using the latest version of Azure SDK. So that's the 2.0 SDKs. They have common libraries across all the different Azure services. And the connection library supports pass-through. So for instance, if I have this web app and I want to connect to Azure storage account and query all the blobs in a container, well, what I would do is I would set up a managed identity, whether it's user assigned when I create it and just assign to this, or system assigned where Azure will create it on my behalf. And then I'll go to Azure role assignments and give them permission through role-based access control to access the different Azure services. And that's awesome because now there's no connection string, there's no secrets, anything I really have to do here. The service has direct access itself. And then when I develop my code in my SDK, when I'm developing on my local machine, I might set up some local credentials. So use my Azure Dev account that I'm using locally. But when I push the code to production, there's nothing. Even in the connection strings, environment, app settings, or whatever it is, that can be exposed. The actual service itself, this app service, has permission to access the SQL database or the storage account or their Azure cache. The idea here is that you have a lot of flexibility in how deep you want to go down this rabbit hole. And today I was just showing you enough to get your feet wet your appetite. But Matt's been posting this link in the Q&A all day. We have a series of hands-on exercises, and one of them is around this specific topic, going deeply into how you can connect different services together, whether you just want to do something simple, storing a secret in Key Vault, or something as complex as using managed identity and giving that managed identity permissions to access other Azure resources. I've even gone as far as using a managed identity for a web app to give it permission to manage Azure itself. So I created a web app that can create new resource groups and create resources, and I created a demo generator. So lots of flexibility, lots of options here. So we gone over a lot this series. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm really excited that everyone really hung in there. Matt posted the link in the Q&A, but it's aka.ms app service at scale exercises. The link's already in the Q&A, but I'll just show it on the screen for a little while. We have a ton of hands-on exercises for you to look at, along with show notes. So every demo I showed you today, I have sample scripts and links to different codes so you can run this yourself. Really encourage you to get hands-on. really encourage you to try out these different services and come up with your own mixtures of Azure services that you want to use with App Service. So I'm going to hang around for a couple more minutes and try and answer as many Q&A questions as I can. Same rules apply. I'm going to answer as much as I can. If I can't answer it, msusdev@microsoft.com. We'll see you there. And we already had a question somebody asked that I didn't really have a good answer to. And Matt escalated it to a team that specializes in that, and they were able to work with that person to come up with an answer. So looking at a couple questions, somebody says, hey, what if I have a secret in a vault and I'm running my application in an Azure virtual machine instead of app service? Can I still use this? Absolutely. So a couple ways you can do that. One is you can use the Key Vault SDK and give that virtual machine access to the Key Vault. And then from the SDK, within the code running on the machine, you can access that secret because that virtual machine has access to it. There is, I believe, on docs.com. I'll always go back to docs.com, right? Azure, and I haven't done this in a while, so I apologize if I'm a little rusty on this, but my very first times using Key Vault was with virtual machines. So here we go, Key Vault with virtual machines. There's a virtual machine extension that you can install that gives you access to certificates and other entities stored within Key Vault. So you definitely do all sorts of interesting things here. For instance, if you want to use Key Vault secrets within scripts or applications you have, let's see, there's another Key Vault integration goes into that quite a bit. Key Vault with storage accounts, and then the client libraries for your application platform's choice. So for example, you can actually use @Azure Key Vault to access Key Vault from within a Node application. So definitely a ton of documentations with hands-on tutorials and examples. So you can definitely jump in and try this out with a virtual machine if you want. Just looking, don't see too many more questions. Somebody says, hey, your app service connects on SSL using port 443. Is that automatic? Did you have to configure that? By default, every app service instance, if you're using the URL that Azure gives you, so the name of the app, AzureWebsites.net, will be accessible whether it's secure or not. Obviously, everybody wants to get to HTTPS, SSL, and use secure URLs whenever possible. But you can just jump in and configure this. So if you configure a custom domain, you can determine whether that custom domain has an SSL body by uploading a certificate. So for example, I can configure a custom domain. I don't want to show any examples because I have I have my own personal site that I do this. I actually host an app service and I do this with. So I'll go in TLS SSL settings, upload my own private key certificates. I'll set it so it only allows HTTPS access and not HTTP. And then I will bind the certificate to my host name here. So somebody says that somebody just asked that question. If port 443 is working, I would just close port 80. That's exactly what we're doing here. If we ever do this again, somebody says, hey, if we have a private database endpoint and we want to integrate with an app service using a virtual network, that would be a wonderful demo to include next time. Not only is that a wonderful demo, Matt's going to take notes. Maybe we'll go build a Microsoft Learn module or do a whole session around that, because I think there's a really compelling story around taking virtual networks, putting your private database endpoints on that virtual networks, killing off public access, and then either having your web app only accessible internally or publicly accessible, but it talks to the database over your private VNet. So that's definitely a really compelling demo. We're going to definitely take a note of that. So it looks like we got wrapped up all the questions. Thank you all for those who's hung around. We definitely have hands-on exercises for you to try. msusdev@microsoft.com if you have any more questions. And if you got feedback and stuff, you can always come to our YouTube channel. You can send an email and let us know, what sessions you want to see in the future. So thank you all for your time. And Matt, I'm going to hand it right back to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Sydney, and thanks to everyone who joined. We'll get this posted on YouTube probably tomorrow, Monday at the latest, and MSUSDev if you've got any more questions. Thanks so much.